Sometimes the smallest creatures carry the heaviest truths. The wind howled down from the Sangre de Cristo peaks that December morning in 1887, turning Copper Falls into a frozen wasteland where only the desperate ventured outdoors. Ezekiel Morrison hadn't spoken to another human being in 3 years, but his father's death had forced him down from his mountain sanctuary to settle debts he'd rather leave buried. At 67, with a white beard stained yellow from tobacco and hands that shook from more than just the cold, Zeke had perfected the art of being invisible, a useful skill for a man carrying secrets that could swing him from the nearest tree. Dutch Kellerman's laughter echoed across the livestock pen like a challenge to the storm itself. "Pick any horse, mountain man," the rancher called out, gesturing toward his prize stallions. "Take your pick of the finest horseflesh in Colorado." But Zeke's eyes had already found what he wanted, a limping gray donkey standing apart from the others, ribs showing through matted fur, one ear torn from some long-ago fight. Something about those dark, knowing eyes stopped Zeke cold. What he couldn't know was that this broken-down animal would lead him to graves he'd never dug, and force him to face murders he thought he'd buried forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence that followed Dutch Kellerman's challenge, stretched thin as winter ice, broken only by the restless shuffling of horses and the wind's relentless moan. Every eye in the livestock pen had turned toward Zeke, some curious, others already savoring the entertainment of watching a hermit make a fool of himself. The ranchers and townsfolk who'd gathered for the weekly auction huddled deeper into their coats, breath steaming in small clouds as they waited to see what the strange mountain man would do. Zeke felt their stares like pinpricks against his weathered skin. 3 years of solitude hadn't dulled his ability to read a crowd, and he could smell their mixture of pity and contempt as clearly as he could smell the manure and hay. To them, he was nothing more than a curiosity, a relic from the territory's wild days, dragged down from his cave by necessity and too proud to know his place. Dutch Kellerman stood beside the fence rail, his bulk wrapped in an expensive wool coat that probably cost more than most men saw in a year. His face carried the satisfied smirk of a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of someone accustomed to buying and breaking whatever crossed his path. Behind him, his foreman Jake Hutchins leaned against a fence post, tobacco juice staining the snow at his feet as he watched the proceedings with lazy interest. "Well?" Dutch called out again, louder this time. "Don't tell me the great Ezekiel Morrison has gone deaf up there in those hills. Though I suppose talking to rocks for 3 years might do that to a man." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but Zeke barely heard them. His attention remained fixed on the donkey, which had raised its grizzled head to look directly at him. Those dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed entirely out of place in such a broken-down creature. The animal's left foreleg bore an obvious injury that caused it to favor the right, and a long scar ran along its neck like a rope burn. Yet something in its steady gaze suggested it knew exactly what was happening and was waiting to see what Zeke would choose. "That one," Zeke said finally, his voice carrying clearly across the pen despite its disuse. He raised one gnarled finger and pointed straight at the donkey. "I'll take that one." The silence returned, deeper this time and tinged with disbelief. Dutch's smirk faltered as he followed Zeke's gesture, and when he saw what the old man had chosen, his face flushed red despite the cold. "You're joking." Dutch's voice held a dangerous edge. "That worthless pack animal. Hell, Morrison, I was trying to be generous. That thing's half dead already. Probably won't last the week." "Looks like it suits me then," Zeke replied, already moving toward the gate. His boots crunched through snow that had been churned to mud by dozens of hooves, and he could feel the crowd's attention following his every step. The other animals, sleek mares and muscled geldings worth small fortunes, shifted nervously as he passed, but the donkey remained perfectly still, watching his approach with those unsettling eyes. When Zeke reached the donkey's side, it turned its head toward him without hesitation, as if they were old acquaintances meeting after a long separation. Up close, he could see that the animal was even more battered than it had appeared from a distance, Grey hair had been rubbed raw in several places, probably from poorly fitted pack gear, and its left ear had been torn nearly in half. Yet when Zeke extended his hand, the donkey stepped forward without fear, its breath warm against his palm. $30, Dutch called out, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. $30 for that piece of buzzard bait, and I'm being charitable. Most would charge you to haul it away. Zeke reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked softly as he counted out the coins. The money represented part of what he'd earned selling his father's mining equipment earlier that morning, tools and machinery that had sat unused in his cabin since the old man's death. It had been enough to settle the outstanding debts and leave him with a small surplus, though not nearly enough to last through another harsh winter without returning to town. As he handed the coins to Dutch, their fingers brushed briefly, and Zeke felt the younger man's hand trembling with suppressed rage. Dutch Kellerman was a man accustomed to gratitude and submission, not mockery disguised as compliance. This public humiliation wouldn't be forgotten or forgiven easily. "Pleasure doing business with you," Zeke said mildly, then turned his attention back to the donkey. He'd expected to fashion some kind of makeshift halter from rope, but when he looked down, he discovered the animal already wore a simple leather bridle, cracked and faded but serviceable. The donkey stepped forward eagerly as Zeke took hold of the reins, its limp barely slowing its movement. Behind them, Dutch's voice carried clearly across the pen, though his words were intended for Jake Hutchins rather than the departing hermit. "Follow them," Dutch said quietly. "I want to know where that crazy old fool goes, and I want to know what game he thinks he's playing." The donkey moved with surprising purpose, through Copper Falls' muddy streets, its limp more pronounced now that they'd left the auction pen behind. Zeke had intended to lead the animal, but found himself following instead as it picked its way around ice-slicked ruts and frozen puddles with the confidence of familiarity. The creature seemed to know exactly where it was going, though Zeke couldn't fathom how. Behind them, he caught glimpses of Jake Hutchins maintaining a careful distance, ducking into doorways and lingering at shop corners with the studied nonchalance of a man trying too hard to appear casual. Dutch's foreman was many things, but subtle wasn't among them. Zeke filed the surveillance away as a problem for later and concentrated on the more immediate mystery of his new companion's behavior. The donkey turned, without prompting, onto the narrow path that led up toward the foothills, its hooves finding purchase on the snow-covered slope with practiced ease. This route would take them to Zeke's cabin, though he'd given the animal no indication of their destination. He told himself it was coincidence. Most paths out of town led generally upward into the mountains, but the donkey's certainty troubled him. By the time they reached the first ridge, Jake Hutchins had fallen far behind, his horse struggling on the increasingly treacherous terrain. Zeke allowed himself a grim smile as he watched the foreman finally give up and turn back toward town. Whatever Dutch Kellerman hoped to learn about his business would have to wait. The cabin appeared through the pines as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, squatting against the mountainside like a weathered tumor. Zeke had built it himself 30 years ago, back when he'd first taken the surveying job that brought him to this territory. 3 years of isolation had left their mark on the structure. Shutters hung askew, and snow had drifted against the walls where chinking had worked loose. But the bones remained sound. The donkey stopped at the cabin's front door and waited, as if expecting an invitation inside. Instead, Zeke led it around to the small lean-to he'd built for his late mule, Jasper. The shelter was adequate for one animal, though barely, with space for feed and a rough wooden stall that blocked the worst of the wind. "This is home," Zeke said, surprised to hear his own voice after hours of silence. "Not much, but it's kept me alive this long." The donkey turned those dark eyes toward him again, and Zeke felt an uncomfortable sensation, as though the animal was measuring him somehow. He shook off the foolish notion and busied himself checking the shelter's condition. The roof would need patching before the next storm, and the water trough had frozen solid, but it would serve. Inside the cabin, Zeke rekindled the fire from banked coals and set about preparing his evening meal. Salt pork and beans, the same combination he'd eaten for more nights than he cared to count. Through the single window, he could see the donkey standing motionless in the lean-to, not eating from the hay he'd provided, just watching the cabin with that same unsettling intensity. The silence pressed against him as darkness fell, heavier now than it had been that morning. For 3 years, solitude had been his refuge, a buffer against memories that still surfaced without warning. Up here, surrounded by pine and granite, he could pretend the past existed only in nightmares. He could almost forget the weight of secrets buried deep in mountain earth, or the way certain sounds, a shovel biting into soil, the rustle of canvas wrapping, could still make his hands shake. But the donkey's presence had introduced something new into his carefully maintained isolation. The animal represented a connection to the world below, a world where Dutch Kellerman's anger simmered and Jake Hutchins asked questions Zeke preferred not to answer. More troubling still was the nagging certainty that his choice at the auction had been no choice at all, that somehow the donkey had chosen him instead. He thought about the money he'd spent that day, counted against what remained in his dwindling reserve. The sale of his father's equipment had provided a temporary reprieve, but winter was far from over, and his supplies wouldn't last until spring. Soon he'd be forced to make another trip to town, perhaps to sell more of his possessions or seek work that would expose him to curious eyes and probing questions. The alternative was to leave entirely, to pack what he could carry, and disappear into the high country where even the most determined pursuit would lose his trail. He'd considered it before during the darkest nights when sleep brought unwelcome visions. But abandoning the cabin meant abandoning the only life he had left, trading the known dangers of his current existence for the uncertain perils of perpetual flight. Through the window, the donkey remained motionless, a dark silhouette against the snow, watching, waiting, as if it knew something Zeke had yet to discover about the choices that lay ahead and the past that refused to stay buried, no matter how deep he tried to bury it. The sound came just before dawn, a rhythmic scraping that pulled Zeke from restless sleep like a fishhook dragged through shallow water. He lay still in the narrow bunk, listening to the noise repeat itself with mechanical persistence. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. Too deliberate for wind, too regular for settling timber. Zeke rolled from beneath the thin blankets and crossed to the window, his bare feet finding every cold spot on the plank floor. Outside, the world lay wrapped in pre-dawn grey, but the lean-to stood empty. The donkey was gone. He pulled on his boots and coat without lighting the oil lamp, muscle memory guiding his movements in the dark. The cabin door opened with its familiar groan, and the mountain air hit his lungs like ice water. The scraping sound continued, clearer now, coming from somewhere behind the cabin where the slope dropped toward a stand of bare aspens. Following the noise, Zeke picked his way down the hillside, his boots breaking through the snow's frozen crust with each step. The scraping grew louder as he approached the tree line, accompanied now by the soft snuffling of an animal working at something in the dirt. He found the donkey 20 yards into the grove, pawing at the base of a lightning-struck aspen whose trunk bore a distinctive scar shaped like a bent horseshoe. The animal had cleared away nearly 2 feet of snow and frozen earth, its hooves somehow finding purchase on ground that should have been impenetrable in winter's grip. "What the devil are you doing?" Zeke whispered, but the donkey ignored him, continuing its methodical excavation. Each scrape revealed more dark soil, and with growing unease, Zeke recognized the disturbed earth for what it was, a filled-in hole, deliberately concealed but not well enough to fool someone who knew what to look for. The donkey stepped back and fixed those dark eyes on him expectantly. In the growing light, Zeke could see that its hooves were caked with dirt and ice, and its breath came in steady puffs that spoke of sustained effort. The animal had been working here for some time, with purpose and determination that defied explanation. Zeke's hands trembled as he approached the excavation. The scarred aspen had served as his landmark 15 years ago when he'd buried his emergency cash, 3 coffee tins containing gold coins and dust, worth enough to buy a new life somewhere far from Colorado territory. He'd never told another living soul about this hiding place, had visited it only twice since to verify its security. No one could know it existed, yet the donkey had led him straight to it. With growing dread, Zeke knelt beside the hole and began clearing away the remaining dirt with his bare hands. The frozen earth scraped his knuckles raw, but he barely felt the pain. 6 inches down, his fingers struck the first tin's lid, then the second, the third. All 3 containers remained exactly where he'd left them, their contents intact. But that impossible fact only deepened his terror. He sat back on his heels, staring at the donkey, whose steady gaze held no surprise at the discovery. The animal had known. Somehow, it had known. How? The word came out as a croak. How did you? The donkey turned and began walking deeper into the grove, moving with that same purposeful gait it had shown in town. After a moment's hesitation, Zeke covered the cache and followed, his heart hammering against his ribs. 30 yards further, the donkey stopped beside a cluster of granite boulders and began pawing at the ground again. This time Zeke recognized the location immediately. Another cache, buried 12 years ago after a particularly profitable surveying contract. Gold and silver he'd skimmed from mineral samples, justified as payment for services the mining companies had never properly compensated. No, Zeke breathed, but the donkey had already begun its excavation. This isn't possible. The animal worked with mechanical precision, clearing snow and earth, as if following a map only it could see. When it stepped back, another carefully concealed burial site lay exposed, its contents undisturbed but no longer secret. The implications crashed over Zeke like an avalanche. If the donkey knew about these caches, sites he'd chosen for their isolation and concealment, what else might it know? His mouth went dry as he considered the other holes he'd dug in these mountains, the ones that didn't contain treasure, but something far more damning. The missing surveyor from '73 who'd asked too many questions about altered mineral reports. The claim jumper who'd threatened to expose Zeke's arrangement with the mining companies. The drifter who'd stumbled across evidence of illegal sampling operations. All of them rested beneath Colorado's soil, their locations known only to Zeke and the ravens that had watched him work. The donkey was already moving again, heading up the slope toward higher ground, toward places where Zeke had buried more than just gold, where secrets far darker than theft lay waiting in frozen earth. He stood at the crossroads of his existence, watching the animal disappear into morning shadows. He could turn back, saddle his horse, and flee into the high country before whatever reckoning approached reached its conclusion. Or he could follow the donkey and discover how much of his past had been laid bare by forces he couldn't begin to understand. The choice would define whatever remained of his life. Zeke remained frozen between the granite boulders as the donkey's form grew smaller against the white expanse above. His legs felt rooted to the spot, as if the mountain itself had claimed him. The animal paused 50 yards up the slope and looked back, waiting with the patience of something that had all eternity to see its purpose fulfilled. Follow it and face whatever comes, or run like the coward you've always been. The voice in his head sounded like his father, Jeremiah Morrison, who'd died believing his son was an honest man making an honest living in the territories. The old man had gone to his grave proud of Ezekiel's surveying work, never knowing how those mineral reports had been doctored, how much gold had found its way into his son's pockets instead of the company ledgers. But theft was the least of it. The donkey wasn't leading him toward his caches for the money. Zeke's hands shook as he pulled his coat tighter against the wind. 30 yards to his left lay another burial site, one he'd dug during the bitter February of 1873. Thomas Brennan, a junior surveyor from the Denver office who'd come to verify some questionable assay results. Too young, too eager, too damned honest for his own good. He'd found the discrepancies in Zeke's reports within 3 days of arrival. "These numbers don't match the samples I've tested," Brennan had said, spreading the papers across Zeke's table. "Either someone's made serious computational errors or what?" Zeke had asked, though he'd already known the answer. "Or someone's been stealing from the company for years." One blow with a surveying hammer had ended the young man's promising career. The frozen ground had fought him for hours, but eventually yielded enough space for a grave that no one would ever find. Brennan's disappearance had been written off as another casualty of the unforgiving wilderness. a tenderfoot who'd wandered into the mountains unprepared and paid the ultimate price. The donkey turned and continued upward, its limp more pronounced on the steeper terrain. Each step seemed to echo in Zeke's chest like a death knell. If the animal knew about Brennan, it would know about the others. Samuel Hodges in 76, the claim jumper who'd threatened to expose Zeke's arrangement with certain mine supervisors. Maria Santos in 79, the Mexican woman who'd witnessed him switching ore samples. Each killing had been easier than the last, necessity hardening into habit. 7 graves. The number crashed through his consciousness like thunder. 7 people who'd trusted him, questioned him, or simply been in the wrong place when he needed silence guaranteed. Zeke looked back down the slope toward his cabin, calculating distances and escape routes. His horse was strong enough to carry him into the high country, and he had supplies cached in remote locations throughout the territory. 3 days hard riding would put him beyond any reasonable pursuit, and from there he could disappear entirely. Montana territory, the Oregon country, maybe even California. But the rational part of his mind knew better. A 67-year-old man couldn't outrun his past indefinitely, not in winter, not with age creeping into his bones and arthritis stiffening his joints. He'd freeze to death in some nameless canyon, or fall from his horse and lie broken until the wolves found him. Either fate seemed preferable to facing what the donkey might reveal. The animal had stopped again, this time beside a distinctive rock formation that made Zeke's stomach clench. 2 parallel stones jutting from the earth like broken teeth, with a stunted pine growing between them. He'd used that landmark because it was unmistakable, impossible to confuse with any other feature in these mountains. Sarah Caldwell. The name whispered through his memory like wind through dead leaves. A geologist's widow who'd inherited her husband's mining claims and hired Zeke to survey them properly. She'd been shrewd enough to spot the discrepancies in his initial assessment, intelligent enough to realize what they meant, beautiful enough that he'd almost convinced himself to confess everything and beg her forgiveness. Instead, he'd crushed her skull with the same hammer that had killed Brennan, then spent 2 days digging through frozen soil while her body lay wrapped in canvas. She'd been the worst of them because she'd trusted him completely, had even invited him into her bed the night before he murdered her. The donkey began pawing at the earth beside the twin stones, and Zeke felt his world tilt sideways. If that grave was disturbed, if Sarah's remains were exposed to daylight after 8 years of darkness, there would be no explaining it away. No pretending it was an accident or self-defense. Graves, and this demon knows them all. The thought struck him like a physical blow. The donkey wasn't just an animal. It couldn't be. Animals didn't possess supernatural knowledge of buried secrets. Animals didn't lead killers to confront their victims with the methodical precision of divine judgment. Zeke stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps that clouded the frigid air. Whatever force had brought this creature into his life, it wasn't finished with him yet. The donkey would lead him to every grave, make him face every sin, until the weight of accumulated guilt crushed what remained of his sanity. The choice was simple: follow the path to damnation, or die running from it. Neither option offered salvation. Zeke stood paralyzed in the snow, watching the donkey's methodical excavation beside Sarah Caldwell's grave. The scraping of hooves against frozen earth sounded like fingernails on a coffin lid. Each pawful of displaced soil brought him closer to a reckoning he'd spent 8 years avoiding. "Run!" the voice screamed through his mind. Saddle the horse and ride hard for the high passes. Die clean in the snow rather than face this. But his legs wouldn't obey. Something deeper than fear held him rooted to the mountainside, a recognition that his time of hiding had finally ended. The donkey had found him, had chosen him, and no amount of running would change what lay buried in these hills. The animal paused in its digging and fixed those dark eyes on him again. In their depths, Zeke saw not judgment, but inevitability, like staring into the face of a cliff before the fatal fall. The creature wasn't his enemy. It was simply the instrument through which justice would finally be served. 7 graves. The number tolled through his consciousness like a bell. 7 people who died for his greed, his cowardice, his desperate need to keep the lies intact. Each killing had felt necessary at the time, justified by circumstances and rationalized by fear. But standing here in the growing daylight, watching the donkey unearth his secrets with supernatural precision, Zeke finally understood the magnitude of what he'd become. A mass murderer. A man who'd traded souls for gold and convinced himself it was survival. The donkey stepped back from its excavation and began walking again, heading toward higher ground where more landmarks waited. More graves. Zeke knew them all by heart. The locations burned into his memory with the clarity that only comes from profound guilt. The wind-carved boulder where Samuel Hodges lay buried, the split-trunk fir that marked Maria Santos's resting place, the avalanche chute where he'd hidden the remains of Jacob Wheeler, the mining engineer who'd grown too suspicious of Zeke's altered reports. Follow it. The thought came unbidden, carrying strange relief. And face what you've done. Face what you are. Zeke took his first step up the slope, then another. His boots broke through the snow's crust with crystalline crunches that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks. Each footfall felt like crossing an invisible boundary, leaving behind the last vestiges of the man who'd convinced himself his crimes were justified. The donkey waited for him to catch up, showing more patience than he deserved. When Zeke drew alongside, the animal resumed its purposeful climb, leading him toward the next revelation. The morning sun caught the creature's coat, revealing patches where malnutrition had thinned the hair and left pink skin exposed to the cold. It should have been suffering, should have sought shelter and feed rather than pursuing this grim pilgrimage. Instead, it moved with unwavering determination, as if fulfilling a sacred duty. Divine retribution. The phrase surfaced from childhood sermons, from his mother's gentle warnings about the wages of sin. Martha Morrison had believed in a God who saw everything, forgave much, but demanded accounting for the darkness men carried in their hearts. She died when Zeke was 16, still believing her son would grow into righteousness. The donkey stopped beside a weathered granite outcrop that jutted from the mountainside like a broken tooth. Zeke's stomach clenched as recognition flooded through him. This was where he'd buried Robert Chen, the Chinese prospector who'd witnessed him switching ore samples at the Lucky Strike claim. The man had spoken little English, might not have understood what he'd seen, but Zeke couldn't take that chance. He'd followed Chen into the mountains and put a pickaxe through his skull while the man slept beside his campfire. The killing had haunted him for months afterward, not from guilt, but from the practical difficulties it created. Chen's disappearance had prompted questions from the territorial marshal, inquiries that came uncomfortably close to Zeke's own activities in the area. He'd weathered the investigation by presenting himself as a concerned citizen helping with the search, even joining the parties that scoured the mountains for traces of the missing man. Now the donkey began its excavation again, clearing snow and earth with mechanical precision. Zeke watched in fascination and horror as the burial site emerged from its concealment. Robert Chen's remains lay 18 inches down, wrapped in the canvas tarp that had covered his prospecting gear. After 7 years, only bones would remain, but bones could tell their own stories to anyone who knew how to read them. Cracked skulls spoke of violence. Isolated graves whispered of murder. The animal stepped back and looked at him expectantly, as if waiting for acknowledgement of what lay exposed. Zeke nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him like ice water. This wasn't about punishment or revenge. It was about truth. The donkey was stripping away the lies he'd built his life upon, forcing him to confront the reality of what he'd done to preserve his secrets. No going back now. The realization brought strange peace. He was committed to this journey, would follow wherever the donkey led. His old life, the careful isolation, the maintained pretenses, the gradual erosion of memory through willful forgetting, was over. The reckoning had begun. The wind picked up as they climbed higher, carrying with it the scent of storm clouds gathering beyond the western peaks. Zeke pulled his coat collar tight and followed the donkey through a stand of bare aspens, their white trunks like ghostly sentinels watching his ascent toward judgment. Each step took him further from the world he'd known and deeper into something that defied rational explanation. The donkey's limp had worsened on the steeper terrain, yet it pressed forward with mechanical determination. Foam flecked its muzzle now, and its breathing came in labored puffs that spoke of exhaustion pushed beyond endurance. But when Zeke slowed his pace out of some misguided compassion, the animal fixed him with those dark eyes and waited until he resumed the proper speed. Whatever force drove this creature wouldn't be deterred by mere physical suffering. They emerged from the trees onto a wind-scoured ridge where the snow lay thin and crusted. Below them, Copper Falls sprawled in the valley like a collection of children's blocks, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys to mark the morning routines of honest folk. People who earned their bread through labor, not murder. People who slept soundly because their consciences bore no weight of buried sins. The sight of the town brought unexpected panic. From this vantage point, Zeke could see the main street where he'd bought supplies yesterday, where Dutch Kellerman had offered him any horse in the corral. Was that truly less than 24 hours ago? The encounter felt like something from another lifetime, a memory belonging to a man who'd still believed his secrets were safe. They'll come looking when the graves are found. The thought struck him like a physical blow. Sheriff Morrison, no relation despite the shared name, was thorough in his investigations. A single exposed skeleton might be explained as an old Indian burial or a prospector's unmarked grave. But 7 murder victims scattered across the mountainside would tell a different story entirely. The donkey had stopped beside a cluster of wind-carved boulders, their surfaces polished smooth by decades of mountain weather. Zeke recognized the formation immediately. Another landmark, another grave. This one contained the remains of James Patterson, a federal mining inspector who'd arrived from Denver with suspicious eyes and uncomfortable questions about irregularities in survey reports. But instead of beginning its familiar excavation, the donkey stood motionless, sides heaving with exhaustion. For the first time since leaving Kellerman's corral, the animal seemed to falter. Its legs trembled with fatigue, and when it tried to lower its head to paw at the ground, the effort nearly sent it tumbling sideways into the rocks. Zeke found himself stepping forward, hands outstretched to steady the creature. The moment his fingers touched its neck, he felt the fever burning beneath the coarse hair. The donkey was sick, had probably been sick when Kellerman put it up for auction. No wonder Dutch had been so eager to let someone else take responsibility for the worthless animal. It's dying. The realization came with unexpected anguish. This creature that had somehow known his darkest secrets, that had led him on this impossible journey of revelation, was killing itself to complete its purpose. Soon it would collapse in the snow and freeze, leaving him alone with his exposed crimes and nowhere left to run. "Easy," Zeke whispered, supporting the animal's weight against his shoulder. "Easy now." The donkey's breathing steadied slightly at his touch, though the fever still raged beneath its skin. When it looked at him now, those dark eyes held something that might have been gratitude, or perhaps just acknowledgement of kindness offered too late to matter. A sound from below made them both freeze, voices carrying up the mountainside on the wind, distant but growing closer. Zeke peered through the morning haze and spotted 3 riders ascending the trail from town, their horses picking careful paths through the snow. Even at this distance, he could make out the glint of a badge on one man's chest. Sheriff Morrison. Panic flooded through Zeke's veins like ice water. Somehow, impossibly, they'd already discovered what the donkey had unearthed. Perhaps another prospector had stumbled across the exposed graves, or maybe someone in town had grown suspicious of his sudden departure with the sick animal. The donkey struggled upright, breaking free from Zeke's support with renewed determination. Despite its obvious suffering, the creature began moving again, heading along the ridge toward the next landmark, the next grave. It wouldn't stop until every secret lay exposed, even if the effort killed it. Zeke cast one last glance at the approaching riders, calculating distances and time. They were still an hour behind, maybe more if they had to dismount and track through difficult terrain. Enough time for the donkey to complete its grim purpose, for Zeke to witness the full scope of his reckoning before the law arrived to claim him. He followed the dying animal deeper into the mountains, toward whatever finale awaited among the bones, and buried gold. Behind them, justice climbed the trail with patient inevitability, while ahead lay only truth and the cold embrace of consequences too long delayed. The reckoning would not be denied. The dying donkey's hooves scraped against loose shale as it struggled up the steepening ridge, each step bringing them closer to the next landmark. Zeke's chest burned with the thin air, but he forced himself to match the animal's relentless pace. Behind them, the three riders had vanished temporarily into a fold of the mountainside, but he could feel their presence like a weight between his shoulder blades. An hour. Maybe less if they push hard. The calculation ran through his mind with mechanical precision, even as another part of him marveled at the donkey's supernatural endurance. The creature should have collapsed by now, fever, exhaustion, and malnutrition combining into a death sentence no amount of determination could overcome. Yet it pressed forward with the inevitability of water flowing downhill, as if its purpose transcended mere physical limitations. They reached a narrow saddle between two peaks, where the wind howled with renewed fury. The donkey paused, swaying dangerously, and for a moment Zeke thought it might finally surrender to the inevitable. Instead, it turned its head toward a distinctive rock formation 50 yards ahead, 3 granite spires jutting from the mountainside like accusing fingers. Maria Santos! Her name whispered through his memory with the weight of accumulated guilt. The Mexican woman had been gathering medicinal herbs when she witnessed him switching ore samples at the Broken Crown claim. She'd spoken to him in rapid Spanish, pointing at his sample bags with growing agitation. Even through the language barrier, her meaning had been clear. She knew what he was doing, and she wouldn't stay silent. The killing had been messier than the others. Maria had fought back with the desperation of someone who understood her danger too late. Her fingernails had left scratches on his face that he'd explained away as an encounter with brambles. The lie had come so easily, just like all the others. Now the donkey resumed its march toward those granite spires, and Zeke felt his careful composure beginning to crack. 7 murders across 11 years, each one buried in his memory alongside the physical evidence. He'd convinced himself they were necessary, justified by circumstances beyond his control. But watching this dying animal sacrifice itself to expose his crimes, he finally understood the truth that had been waiting in the darkness all along. I am a monster. The admission struck him like a physical blow. Not a survivor forced into desperate choices, not a victim of circumstances beyond his control. A predator who had killed 7 innocent people to protect his reputation and his gold. The careful rationalizations he'd built around each murder crumbled like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The donkey stumbled, catching itself against his shoulder. Its weight was shocking, so little flesh left on those bones that supporting it felt like embracing a skeleton wrapped in hide. Yet when Zeke looked into those dark eyes, he saw not accusation but something that might have been compassion. As if the creature understood the weight he'd been carrying all these years, the poison that had been eating him alive from the inside. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Why are you doing this?" The donkey offered no answer beyond a labored breath that steamed in the frigid air. It pulled away from his support and continued toward the granite spires, leaving him no choice but to follow. With each step, Zeke felt the careful architecture of his isolation collapsing. The hermit's cabin, the self-imposed exile, the gradual erosion of human connection, all of it had been an elaborate attempt to bury guilt that refused to stay dead. They reached Maria's grave as the sun climbed toward its zenith, casting sharp shadows among the granite formations. The donkey began its familiar excavation, pawing weakly at earth that had been frozen solid for months. But the effort was beyond its remaining strength. After a few feeble attempts, it collapsed sideways into the snow, sides heaving with exhaustion. Zeke found himself kneeling beside the animal, his hands moving without conscious direction to provide what comfort he could. The fever burned like a forge beneath its skin, and its breathing had become shallow and irregular. It was dying, had probably been dying since the moment Dutch Kellerman offered it for auction. A dying creature leading a dying man to face his sins. The parallel struck him with devastating clarity. They were both at the end of their journeys, both preparing for whatever reckoning awaited in the darkness beyond. But while the donkey had chosen to spend its final hours in service of some incomprehensible justice, Zeke had wasted decades hiding from the truth of what he'd become. A distant sound made him look back down the trail. The riders were closer now, close enough that he could make out individual faces through the morning haze. Sheriff Morrison rode in the lead, his expression grim with purpose. Beside him, 2 deputies scanned the mountainside with the methodical attention of men following a clear trail. They'd found something. A grave, evidence, some piece of his carefully hidden past that had finally surfaced after years of burial. The donkey's supernatural knowledge was becoming reality, transforming secrets into exposed bones that would tell their own stories to anyone willing to listen. Zeke turned back to the dying animal, understanding flooding through him like ice water. The choice was no longer whether to run or stand his ground. The choice was how to face the truth that had been waiting for him all along. The donkey's labored breathing grew more erratic as Zeke cradled its fever-burned head in his lap. Each shallow gasp might be its last, yet those dark eyes remained fixed on the granite spires where Maria Santos lay buried. Even dying, the creature's purpose burned with relentless clarity. It won't let go until the job is finished. Zeke understood now what was being asked of him. The donkey had brought him this far, exposed enough graves to damn him 7 times over, but it no longer possessed the strength to complete its mission. The final revelation, the last truth that needed dragging into daylight, would have to come from his own hands. He gently moved the donkey's head onto a patch of pine needles and stood, his joints protesting after the long climb. The wind had died to an eerie stillness, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Below them, the riders had disappeared again behind a stand of timber, but their presence pressed against his consciousness like an approaching storm. 20 minutes, maybe 30. His hands found the rough granite of the nearest spire, fingers tracing the natural handholds he remembered from 11 years ago. The rock was slick with ice, treacherous, but he began to climb anyway. Maria's grave lay on a narrow ledge 15 feet up, high enough that scavengers couldn't reach it, hidden enough that casual travelers would never think to look. The ascent that had once been effortless now left him gasping. Age and isolation had stolen his strength, left him soft where survival demanded hardness. Twice his boot slipped on ice-glazed stone, sending him scrambling for purchase while loose rocks clattered into the void below. But desperation drove him upward, past fear, past exhaustion, toward the reckoning that awaited. The ledge was exactly as he'd left it. A natural shelf barely 3 feet wide, screened by stunted pine that grew from cracks in the granite. Behind the largest tree, a careful arrangement of stones marked where he'd laid Maria Santos to rest. Her body would be bones now, like all the others, but bones had their own terrible eloquence. Zeke began moving the stones with mechanical precision, his hands remembering the pattern, even after all these years. Each rock had been chosen for size and weight, fitted together to create a barrier against wind and weather. He'd built it like a proper cairn, some twisted mockery of respect for the woman he'd murdered. The first glimpse of canvas sent ice through his veins. The tarp had held better than expected at this altitude, the cold preserving what time would have destroyed. But when he peeled back the frozen fabric, the skull that grinned up at him told the story he'd spent 11 years trying to forget. The pick mark above the left temple, the shattered orbital bone, evidence written in calcium and preserved by mountain cold. Maria Santos had been gathering wild sage when she witnessed his crime at the Broken Crown claim. She'd confronted him in rapid Spanish, her voice rising with righteous anger as she pointed at his switched sample bags. Even through the language barrier, her meaning had been unmistakable. She knew what he was doing, and her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. The killing had been brutal, desperate. She'd fought back with surprising strength, raking her nails across his face before the prospector's pick ended her resistance. He'd told people in town that he'd tangled with a mountain cat, displayed the scratches as proof of his narrow escape. Another lie piled onto the growing mountain of deception that defined his life. Now her bones lay exposed to mountain sky, ready to tell their truth to anyone with eyes to see. The fracture patterns would speak of violence. The isolated grave would whisper of concealment. Sheriff Morrison was thorough. He'd read the story written in calcium and draw the obvious conclusions. A sound from below made Zeke peer over the ledge's edge. The donkey had struggled back to its feet, somehow finding reserves of strength that should have been exhausted hours ago. It stood swaying beside the granite spires, those dark eyes turned upward to watch his work, waiting for him to finish what it had started, bearing witness, making sure the truth comes out completely. The riders emerged from the timberline, close enough now that Zeke could make out Sheriff Morrison's weathered features and the grim set of his jaw. They'd found the other graves, probably followed the donkey's trail from one excavation site to the next, uncovering his buried sins with methodical precision. By now they knew exactly what they were hunting. Zeke began his descent, moving carefully on ice-slicked stone. There was no escape left. No point in running. The donkey's supernatural knowledge had transformed his hidden crimes into exposed evidence, and justice climbed the mountainside with patient inevitability. His only choice now was how to face what he'd spent decades trying to forget. The dying animal watched him reach solid ground, those mysterious eyes holding depths that defied understanding. It had sacrificed its final strength to bring him to this moment of truth, leading him through a pilgrimage of revelation that ended with 7 graves exposed to mountain sky. My confessor, my guide to judgment. The ordeal was complete. Now only the reckoning remained. The donkey collapsed before Zeke reached the bottom of the granite spire. He scrambled down the last few feet of ice-slicked rock, panic flooding his chest as the animal's legs buckled beneath it. The creature hit the frozen ground with a sound like breaking kindling, its fever-ravaged body finally surrendering to exhaustion that should have claimed it hours ago. No, the word tore from Zeke's throat as he dropped to his knees beside the dying animal. Not yet, not now. Those dark eyes found his face, still holding that impossible depth of understanding, but the light behind them was fading like embers in a dying fire. The donkey's breathing came in shallow gasps that steamed briefly in the mountain air before vanishing. Each breath might be its last. Zeke's hands moved frantically over the creature's neck and flanks, feeling for a pulse that fluttered, weak and irregular, beneath the coarse hair. The fever that had sustained the animal through its supernatural journey was consuming what little life remained, burning through flesh and bone with merciless efficiency. It's dying. The one thing that knew the truth, that could have explained how this was possible. Dying. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Without the donkey, he had no way to understand what had happened, no explanation for the impossible knowledge that had guided them from grave to grave. Sheriff Morrison would find 7 exposed murder victims and a hermit with obvious guilt written across his face, but the mystery of how the crimes came to light would die with this fevered animal. Worse, without the donkey's guidance, Zeke couldn't be certain they'd found everything. The creature had led him to 7 graves, but were there others? Hidden caches of evidence he'd forgotten in his guilt-ridden isolation. The animal had known secrets that Zeke himself had buried so deep they'd become lost to conscious memory. What if there are more victims? What if I've forgotten murders the way I forgot where I hid the gold? The thought sent ice through his veins. 3 years of isolation had eroded more than just his social connections. Whole sections of his past had become hazy, uncertain, like trying to remember details of a fever dream. The careful mental catalogue of his crimes might be incomplete, riddled with gaps that only the donkey's supernatural knowledge could have filled. Below them, the sound of approaching horses grew louder. Sheriff Morrison and his deputies were close enough now that Zeke could hear their voices carrying on the wind, discussing the trail of disturbed earth that led up the mountainside. They'd followed the donkey's excavations like breadcrumbs, uncovering decades of buried guilt with systematic precision. 20 minutes. Maybe less. The donkey's eyes found his again, and in their fading depths, Zeke saw something that might have been forgiveness. as if the dying creature understood his panic, his desperate need for answers that would die with it. The animal's head moved slightly, barely a twitch, but enough to direct Zeke's attention toward the pine grove, where 2 more landmarks waited in shadow. There are others. More graves, more victims. The knowledge hit him with devastating certainty. The donkey had been leading him through his crimes in some kind of order. Chronological, geographical, he couldn't be sure. But their journey was incomplete, cut short by the animal's failing strength. Sheriff Morrison would find 7 bodies and think he'd uncovered the full scope of Zeke's guilt, never knowing that more victims lay hidden in the frozen earth. Zeke pressed his hand against the donkey's neck, feeling the pulse grow weaker with each passing moment. "Tell me," he whispered desperately. "Show me where the others are." But the animal's eyes were glazing over, its breathing becoming more erratic. Whatever force had sustained it through this impossible pilgrimage was finally exhausted. Soon it would be gone, taking its secrets with it into whatever darkness awaited beyond. The voices below grew closer, accompanied by the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves in snow. Sheriff Morrison called out to one of his deputies, something about rope and evidence bags. They were preparing for the grim work of excavation, ready to catalogue Zeke's crimes with methodical thoroughness. But they'll never find them all. The donkey was the only witness, the only guide, and it's dying. The irony was devastating. After decades of hiding his murders, Zeke finally wanted the full truth exposed. Wanted every victim found, every crime acknowledged, every debt paid. But the supernatural messenger that had brought him this far was failing, leaving his confession incomplete. The donkey's eyes closed, its breathing becoming so shallow that Zeke had to press his ear to its ribs to detect any sign of life. The animal was slipping away, and with it went his only hope of achieving complete redemption. "I'll die with secrets still buried. Even at the end, even facing justice, part of my guilt will remain hidden." The final failure crushed down on him like an avalanche. All seemed lost.